I'm going to introduce you to Mitchell Ray. It's always a pleasure, when we do these things to get Vanier alum, right? Which Mitchell is actually Vanier alum. He's also now these days a master's degree candidate at Concordia University in the Department of Sociology. And Mitchell also heads up one of the biggest, LGBTQ2 plus advocacy groups or organizations in the project and in the province, I should say. And the group's name, he's the executive director, and the organization's name is Project 10. So I'm very glad to welcome Mitchell, and I'm going to turn things over to you immediately. Once you're done, we'll get some Q&A from the crowd and or people attending online.
All right. So I don't know if people can hear me. I can't see if people can hear me, but I guess you'll give me a thumbs up. Or...
Yes, they most definitely can.
Okay, perfect. So, hi, and thanks, for that introduction. So my name is Mitchell. I use masculine pronouns, and then as you just heard, so I was a Vanier student. I did social science. I did the international studies program, and I got a certificate in women's studies. Then I went to Concordia, more women's studies and sexuality studies. And now, so I'm currently a grad student. So I'm getting my master's in sociology. And I do also work at Project 10, which is a nonprofit organization. We work with 2S LGBTQIA youth between the ages of 14 and 25. And I work there as the executive director, which is really great. We're a team of 8 folks. We actually all happen to be BIPOC, and it's a completely by and for organization. And I'll get into a bit more about like what all of that means as well. So today for the talk, I wanted to discuss what identity was, more specifically how identity plays a role in our lives. I think that I noticed a lot that people sometimes have misunderstandings about what identity is or how identity can actually impact our lives in a lot of ways, often in the day-to-day sort of operations, how we move through the world. In 2 ways. One, because of how we understand ourselves and our own identity, but also how others perceive our identity, and then therefore how they treat us. And I want to speak about that mainly, through a lens of thinking around like queerness and, 2S LGBTQIA issues. Absolutely. I think in large part, that's where a lot of my focus is in my work right now, like definitely working at Project 10. I'm surrounded by sort of those issues, and I meet people every day who are currently struggling either with their identity or otherwise are struggling with people who are struggling with their identity. But also at the same time, I think it's definitely important to know that a lot of my work outside of Project 10 revolves mostly around race and critical race theory, and also around disability and disability justice and activism as well. And I think ultimately all of that sort of culminates into the way that I look at identity and think about identity through this lens of intersectionality. So for folks who don't know, intersectionality, it's like a term that essentially it was coined by someone named Kimberly Crenshaw, who was talking specifically about the way that her as a Black woman, both like she needed to be understood specifically in the context of the law as both Black and a woman when she was experiencing a lot of violence and harassment at a period of her life. And I'm sure many other periods before and after that as well. But essentially intersectionality refers to this way that, we can have multiple sort of avenues in which like our lives play out through our identity. And often those places cross, right? It's not that you would just be one thing or just another thing. There's often, very often, like ourselves, we find ourselves in a multitude of those different spaces. And I think that like, luckily from just sort of the work that I've done around race, around disability, and now around queer issues as well, that sort of taught me in a really like, I think a significant way how intersectionality really does ultimately end up playing a role in how we as people who are not just like, raceless, sexless, genderless bodies, like ultimately there's a lot of things that impact the ways that we're perceived by others, but also how we perceive ourselves. It makes a difference in the communities that we reach out to, or the people that we find ourselves with often, or the ways that those who find themselves with us, how they'll treat us, how they'll interact with us. And that can ultimately have, this huge impact in the ways that, where we go to school, what kind of people we hang out with, the types of jobs we get, discrimination that we can face, just even discrimination, the way someone might treat you on the road when you're driving, or the way that you might be treated at a job, or if you're a customer somewhere. And I think that what I want to, I guess, first talk about, when I was talking to staff on our team, and I was saying, oh, I'm going to be at Vanier giving this talk. We sort of had like a bit of a brainstorming session, and we talked a bit about what we all felt would be important that that I share with all of you today. And the major takeaways sort of from everyone on staff, again, being a buy-in for organization, meaning that all the staff at the organization also happen to identify, within the 2S LGBTQIA sort of community. We all definitely did talk about how like those parts of our lives were really important. But also all of us talked about all these other different things that were important to our identities as well. And I think that, again, that speaks to, the ways that we as people like are perceived by the world. So I just want to give a couple examples. So we work with a lot of youth. I mean, it's a group, it's 14 to 25, right? So they're all, as we consider them, youth. And there's a lot of folks who come to see us who might find themselves both perhaps, yes, queer, but also disabled or racialized or in a lower socioeconomic status. And I think that what we see ultimately is that there becomes this big struggle between these different parts of their identity that can sort of not fight with each other, not clash with each other, but in the ways that often they aren't recognized as playing into each other. And what that can mean is it often invisibilizes those parts of themselves. And we can see that a lot in general with sometimes a lot of people when they are struggling with their own identity, it's often because parts of their identity have been ostracized or seen as lesser than. And often that's a result of heteronormativity, which refers to when people assume that everyone is heterosexual, cisnormativity, which like means that everyone just assumes people are cisgendered or someone who's like sex, assigned at birth also corresponds to their gender identity. The way that, there's an assumed able-bodiedness, that people just assume that everyone is able-bodied, doesn't have mental illness or other disabilities or impairments. And all of these things, ultimately what happens is because we've created this assumption, this baseline of, oh, well, of course that person will be straight, and of course that person will be cis, and of course that person will be able-bodied and healthy. What happens is those who aren't, who don't fit into all of those categories or even just doesn't fit into one of them, become sort of othered because now you're not the normal, you're not the standard, you're not what someone had expected. So you're ultimately just something, you're off in some way, you're seen as othered. And this is sort of what results in the ways that people become ostracized because of their identities. And it can result in a lot of people keeping a lot of those things to themselves for a really long time, sometimes forever, unfortunately. But also, I think that what we also talked about together as a staff was the way that there's a lot of parts of our identities that we can't always hide whether we'd want to or not, so there's definitely times where people can make, unfortunately, really strategic decisions about the parts of their identity that they choose to share with others because they know what type of harm they can expose them to. But there's also a lot of times that our identity is not something that we can mask or hide, so if someone is someone who's racialized and is clearly read as Black or brown, unfortunately, there's not really that choice that people are given. And that's another way that identity plays a huge part in our lives without often our like ability to control it. I don't want to say without our consent, but essentially, we're not ever given necessarily a choice about what parts that we want to share with others. And then even when there are parts that we want to share, when they are shared, it can still result in that othering because someone goes, oh, well, I assume that person would have been straight, or I assume that person would have been, cisgender. And then what happens after that point is often when we start seeing youth at Project 10, it's folks who've maybe been, turned away by their family, by other people in their communities, from their friends. And, I think that that's part of also what makes identity really great is because there's ways that folks can find community. Like, I don't want to sit here and just be like, oh, it's all so sad. The second you identify something, it's tragic, or there's some sort of tragic association to being parts of, a marginalized or oppressed group based on your identity. Because Project 10, for me, I see it really as a place where folks can come in, where they can find community, where they can find kinship, where they can find chosen family and form family connections, friend connections with folks who do share their identity. And that's another powerful way that ultimately the way that we as people are political, whether we like it or not, our position and our positionality impacts the ways that others see us. And that's often why folks come to Project 10 and find a lot of community and a lot of solidarity with one another, because we have a shared understanding. That's part of why it's really important to us that the organization be buy-in for, meaning that when youth come to receive services from us, it's incredibly, incredibly important to us that they can see themselves in us. We see the difference. It's often the reason why folks, unfortunately, are not going to, their high school guidance counselor, who might be like a 40-year-old, just like person who maybe is completely out of touch with what, the needs are of like 15 or 16-year-olds. It might be someone who themselves is just like a straight, cisgender, able-bodied person. Like there's a lot of importance to someone having shared those experiences and being part of your identity group that makes like the importance of places like Project 10 really crucial to communities and to folks, especially those who are marginalized. And I think that's ultimately, for me, why I was quite happy when I heard that I would get to speak today, because I think that there's a lot of things that people don't necessarily see unless they're in community work or who work around these communities that perhaps other folks might not be as aware of, such as the ways that like we as people who are marginalized, and I say we speaking for myself, and I'm sure other people here also maybe identify within other certain parts of themselves as well. But, speaking we as Project 10, as an organization that is buy-in for, we understand why identity, impacts the ways that someone comes to us and says that they have no friends at school, that they're being bullied at school, that they've been kicked out of their house, that they can't hold a job. It's not for lack of trying. It's not for someone being lazy or a difficult person. There's these things about their identity that have led to this sort of ostracization. And again, we really would argue that it comes from this assumption of being straight, this assumption of being cis, this assumption of being able-bodied, these ways that people are automatically assumed to be in certain boxes and that's the danger as well, is when we assume people should be in certain boxes, there's almost a quote unquote disappointment when someone doesn't fit in that box. Even if we don't want to say it, often that tends to be how folks feel, when you have, a baby who's born and they do a hearing test and they, the language is often to fail a hearing test. Often a doctor will say like, I'm sorry that your child is deaf. Like already it's, oh, someone would have hoped for something or wanted something, and now it's a disappointment. It's a negative if someone doesn't fit within those ideals that society has created. And the same thing happens, when parents, even with the best intentions, might say to their children, we hear a lot of kids who come to us and say that, they came out to their parents and their parents took it well, but their parents also use language like, oh, it's okay, even if you like, maybe it's a young boy who, his parents said to him, even if you like another boy, like I'll still accept you. But it's still, that language, it really matters, because it's still saying, yeah, well, even if you have, if you have to do that, if you have to, have this negative thing about you or something that is disappointing to someone. And I think that not everyone always realizes how harmful or like damaging that language can be, because then they're coming to our support groups and going like, I'm happy that my parents didn't kick me out, but also they seem really, really disappointed that I'm not straight or that I'm not cis. And we see this happen over and over again. And I think what ultimately sort of results from that is that we've created these new communities and these new spaces that are like incredibly, incredibly important to solidarity, survival, resilience. But at the same time, it can trap people. And I think that it's something that we often don't talk about with identity. It's often painted as a really great thing. And obviously, I'm doing part of that work as well by saying identity is great because we find community and then we can be together in groups that are that all share similar experiences. And it's not to say that it becomes this, insular group that, no one can get into or that you're trapped in, but it does result in these stereotypes that can emerge around certain groups of people, these stereotypes or these prejudices that will come about because folks sort of isolate themselves together and become sort of this one like group or this one clique that's seen, or this one subpopulation or microculture. And what becomes damaging there is when people don't understand the intersectionality within communities. So we see often that like queer communities, like LGBTQ communities often are not always super accepting of people of color. I think, even just in the way that we can use language around queer community is that we already, even myself, we default to saying like, oh, the queer community is not accepting to people of color because queer community is often seen by default as white community, right? Like the fact that we even would have to say the queer community doesn't accept people of color can often invisibilize queer people of color who are absolutely part of the queer community. But it also creates, again, this sort of standard, like here's what the norm is, and the norm is that like LGBTQ people are white. And so then we can make statements like this community is not accepting to this group. But also at the same time, those can be the realities. It's why Project 10, we place a lot of emphasis on having different sort of like different types of groups. So we have a group just for queer and trans people of color. So only for folks who are racialized or BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. But within that group, we have just an Indigenous talking circle for folks who are Two-Spirit, Indigiqueer, and Indigenous, who also are LGBTQ. Like there are all these things that we sort of notice that are important because different spaces like become so homogenous often because of the ways that we like hold on to identity. And yes, identity is important. Like when we were speaking together, all of the staff, everyone had said, yes, identity plays a role in my life every day. Like everyone agreed wholeheartedly that identity played a role in their life every day. But then we also agreed that we wish identity didn't play a role in our lives every day, despite the like places it's gotten us to today and the ways that it's given us certain opportunities and those opportunities to meet people within our communities and be where we are today. At the same time, it can be, really harmful. There was one staff who was saying that their father, like who's Indigenous, has a sticker that says "Every child matters" on their car, and they put it on recently, and have been receiving way more microaggressions or on the road, just like based on that sticker, right? Like putting something that shows solidarity with like Indigenous communities. It's like the ways that that person will now like face a lot more aggression and violence on the road. Not to be that person who brings up a bunch of statistics, but we know already in Canada, like a big survey had been done, the Trans Pulse Canada survey. I think it was 2018, 2019, but over 50% of respondents said their mental health was poor. 1 in 3 had considered suicide that year. 1 in 20 had attempted suicide. This survey, again, the Trans Pulse survey being for trans individuals. So 1 in 3 had considered suicide. 1 in 20 attempt suicide. I think it was like just under 50% of the trans population in Canada is under the poverty line. Like there are real, very serious ways that identity can have detrimental effects on the people who embody those identities. But ultimately, I think what the staff and the team we were getting at is that we wish identity didn't play a role in our lives every day because it's those identities that then people act upon, right? It's, I can wake up every day, I'm queer, I'm trans, I'm Chinese, that's fine. And I can move about my day, but it's then the ways that other people will interact with me. It can be the transphobia that I experience as a trans person. It can be the homophobia that I experience as a queer person, or the racism that I experience as someone who's Asian. And that's where, we speak about why identity, we wish it didn't play a role in our lives, but the reality is it does play a role in our lives. It plays a role in our lives, whether we're part of marginalized groups or not. If you're just like, the straight, cis, able-bodied, 6 foot tall white man, identity is 100% playing a role in your life. And it's absolutely resulting in the ways that you might be getting a lot more privileges than someone else. But, the ways that identity right now are understood as only being a term associated with those who are marginalized. Like you'll have an identity if you're queer, but if you're straight, you're still straight. That's still part of your positionality. It's still part of the way that the world receives you. It's just that you happen to be straight and therefore fit within, let's say, a heteronormative model of the way that we see society. But it's this sort of invisibilizing both of, again, the way that heteronormativity invisibilizes queer identity, but it also invisibilizes straight identity because it's seen as the norm, and therefore it's not even of note when someone is straight, or it's not of note when someone is white or is cisgender. But that also is absolutely playing a role in the ways that you might be moving through the world, the ways that you might be interacting with other people. And it can lead to you being the type of person who, again, like totally well-meaning, might say to their child, like, oh, it's okay if you're gay, like I'll still accept you, but again, like you'll still accept because it's not really what you were hoping for your child not to be straight. I think that there's this, and it's when we aren't able to recognize or realize necessarily how like our identities, how our positionality is playing a real effect in how we move through the world, how we treat others, and how others would receive us, that's where the danger comes from. And that's what results, I would argue, in the ways that, queer and trans people, more than 50% have like poor mental health, or who are considering suicide or who are under the poverty line, because we're not always cognizant of how these biases that we have towards groups that we've now othered or placed aside from the norm, how those like prejudices or how those like beliefs or stereotypes that we have can actually impact the real ways that, the youth that we see at the organization are coming to us and going through, to be honest, like a really tough time. I think there's some other folks who are speaking on identity, especially with COVID. And, I'm sure everyone here, like I'm also 25, like, I consider myself young. Like COVID has been really tough, and I don't take that away from anyone. But when we think of, okay, so what does COVID mean for folks who are, queer? If your parents don't, let's say, accept your gender identity, so they're not using the right names, they're not using the right pronouns, maybe your school was on board, but now maybe you can't like go to school and be safe there. Are you able to, like, in Zoom classes, put the name that you want to have? Any after school activities were pretty much cut everywhere. Like a lot of, I think, elementary schools and high schools were cutting all their after school programs. So any places where folks were getting to be in spaces that they felt safe, all of that was sort of taken away, and people were sort of left in their homes in places that often weren't very accepting. And it became, I think, a really suffocating space, and it still is for many people, around their identity, because there's no way to express your identity in ways that feel safe right now for a lot of folks who are queer, for a lot of folks who are trans. And that's what we're seeing right now most often at Project 10, is youth who are coming to us, again, as a result of their identity, and that's why they're coming to Project 10, but who are coming to us saying, like, I don't know what to do right now. It's difficult because we also recognize that the folks that we're seeing probably, are those who have sort of a chance to get support, because we know that the youth who are not safe in their homes, who can't get on a Zoom call to Zoom one of our like intervention workers and talk to someone and get like mental health support, because they're not even safe enough to join a Zoom call and tell us that, like, we're not able to reach them right now. And that, I think, for me, is like a clear indication of how their identity is playing a massive role in how they're able to move through the world, feel safe in the world, and be, I think, accepted in the world in ways that, just continue to compound based on if that person is also disabled or also racialized or also happens to be, both queer and trans, these ways that we can't just look at one thing at a time. And it's what Kimberly Crenshaw was trying to say, I think, from the beginning, just to go back to that point on intersectionality, was that, she didn't want to just be looked at as someone who was Black, and she didn't just want to be looked at as someone who was a woman. It was incredibly important that she was understood as a Black woman. Like, if you think about misogynoir, like, it was incredibly important that she was understood as a Black woman, that it wasn't just that someone was being racist to her, but it wasn't just that someone was being sexist to her, right? It was that they were being both racist and sexist at the same time. Like these identities that we have, you can't always separate them, and they really shouldn't be separated in many cases, because the ways that we identify, whether someone reads us that way or not, it's still going to be our identity. It's still going to be how we understand the world, how we move through the world, and then ultimately how the world is going to interact with us. If that makes sense. It's also really hard to tell if people are understanding what I'm saying. I'll be honest, doing an online talk, this is challenging. But maybe someone can nod or something. Okay. Yeah, okay. I think you're on mute, but I saw you nod, so it works for me. Yeah, I'm worrying I'm speaking too fast as well, but I think what I guess I want to finish on, and then hopefully I won't take more than 15 minutes to finish on it, and then leave like time for a Q&A, is that what happens with identity often, that if I can say, like, what happens with identity when someone does sort of discover part of themselves or part of this identity, because it's not necessarily that like we're born day one and we already know every single part of who you are, right? But I think that when we understand parts of our identity, it can ultimately result in us sort of realizing why maybe things went the way they did, why we've understood certain social interactions or social environments, how we felt safe or unsafe in certain spaces, the way that we did. Because, for example, like I'll just use myself as an example. I wasn't like, again, day one, I was like, oh, I know I'm trans from, the moment I was born, like absolutely not. But when I did realize that I was trans, and it was from getting to meet other folks who were trans and then discussing their experiences, being able to compare sort of their experiences to my own, and then sort of understand how I was understanding my gender a lot better. That was sort of what helped me realize I was trans, but it also, in a sense, brought a lot of relief. Like, obviously, it was a bit stressful because it made me think, what is my life going to look like now that I know I'm trans? But it also brought to myself a lot of relief, going, okay, so maybe that's why I'd been feeling this way. Maybe this is why I'd been, dealing with this or dealing with that or feeling these sort of struggles, was because I was able to name what I was feeling and sort of put a name to how I had been experiencing certain things. And, I know that nowadays a lot of people, give a lot of, flack to, how there's, quote unquote, like a new term every day, like we hear these things that people are saying. But, I would argue that there's a lot of power and a lot of meaning to someone's ability to name themselves and to name how they identify without having to be named by others. We see often in society, if you just go back, in history, the ways that like science as a field has evolved to basically force people to identify, to force people to be named and labeled. This goes back to, really, really goes back to, an age where everything was done by confession, right? Like if you had sinned or done something bad, you went to confession and you told someone. And I would argue that's probably a big start of this naming of sin or naming of just yourself or your experiences. So it went from, okay, so if someone does something bad, you have to tell us, you have to name it, you have to describe it, so they could sort of categorize it and then categorize that person and label it as, here's what the sin, here's how you atone for that sin. Like it was very specific, it was very systematic, that you would name something, like, and then that through that confession, we've sort of developed this understanding of science of, okay, well, let's label people by races using like sort of, ultimately racism, to use these different fields of like now we understand as pseudoscience, to label people, to label sexualities, all these studies that were done on sex and sexuality. Sex went just from sexual practices to, okay, well, if you do this sexual practice, you're this, and if you do that sexual practice, then it means you're this, and if you do this or that sexual practice, for a long time you were just a person who did these acts or who did those acts. And then again, it was the ways that society wanted to be able to label absolutely everything, control absolutely everything, and be able to, because when you get to name something, often you get control over it because you've chosen the name, you've chosen the definition, you get to become the expert on it, right? So we had all of these cisgendered, straight, white people who were like, I'll tell you what you are, I'll give you the name for it, I'll give you the definition, and that's what you are, and this is what you get when you're within those definition categories. And so when today we look at the ways that a lot of folks in the queer community, especially, are becoming empowered to name themselves, it's often like a really radical act of resistance. And I'm not saying that like every young person who's like finding these new terms and identities is thinking back to the age of confession and how people were repressed and forced into identities. But instead, I think that what it shows is that we are like engaging right now in a really exciting time, a really radical time where we're being allowed to name ourselves, where we're saying, okay, that's nice that like all of these like straight, cisgendered, sexuality scholars sat down in a room and decided if you did this, this is your identity, and therefore XYZ. We're able now to name ourselves, to name our own identities, say, here's how we identify both in our name, our gender, our pronouns. All of these things, can frustrate people who want to have the control over naming otherwise, who say, well, you shouldn't get the right to name yourself. We'll tell you if you're male, if you're female, if you're heterosexual or, homosexual. There's still, we see today, a huge push for people to, for like medical experts to be allowed to determine what you are or who you are. And it does, I think, bring up, a lot of, like what we're seeing now is it's bringing up a lot of tension between these communities, between straight and cis communities and queer communities, where, we're being told that we have to see psychologists or other, quote unquote medical professionals to get certain diagnoses, or to be told exactly what our sexual practices mean and then what that should mean for us. And, when people start saying that they want to identify as bisexual or pansexual or asexual or demisexual, or all these different ways that people are naming their sexualities, or different ways they're understanding their gender beyond man or woman into trans masculine, trans feminine, non-binary, gender queer, gender fluid, agender, all of these ways that we're being allowed to rename ourselves, we're still currently, honestly, still seeing a huge push against it, right? Of what's with, why is there another letter on this, LGBTQ alphabet? Why do we need another name? Why can't we just have, one or two? I don't understand why we need more. They're always, inventing other ones. Like it all ultimately, consciously or not, is coming from this desire for a certain group of people to be allowed to name the experiences of everyone else. Because if they're allowed to name those experiences, then they're also deciding that they can, name how those people should be treated or how we should perceive those people. And that's why I ultimately, right, identity is super important, not only because of how it plays a role in our lives, but identity becomes important when we're determining what our identity is, right? It's not just about like, yes, identity plays a role in our life, of course. I mean, that's the title of what I chose for the talk to be. But identity plays the biggest role in our life when we picked what our identity was, not when we were told that, we were going to be presumed to be straight or presumed to be cis or presumed to be able-bodied. Our identity really comes into play when we get to decide for ourselves and embrace sort of those choices for ourselves about who we are, how we understand ourselves and our identity, and that we get to define it and label it ourselves. It's part of why people still push back again against the term queer, because queer often is just seen as a very vague, quote unquote, nebulous term that doesn't have a strict or firm definition. Same for trans. And that's why people want to say, okay, queer, so are you gay? Are you bi? Like we hear those types of discourses happening, and it's coming from still that desire to be able to name precisely, to be able to name exactly, to name in a very like linear, very Western scientific method sort of model of, okay, well, queer means what? Well, is it like bisexual? Is it like you can see the way that people are searching and pulling and trying to get to essentially name you for yourself. You know, when I tell people that I'm queer, I can see their wheels turning and I can see them wanting to say, so are you gay? Like you can see the way that they just want to be able to name you. They want to be able to define you for themselves. And that's where a lot of the power from identity comes right now, I would argue, is when we're just getting to identify for ourselves and not have to follow a certain subscription of like a very, very strict model of what identity should be, like in the same way that Kimberly Crenshaw didn't want to be understood as just Black or just a woman. And it was important that she was able to identify herself and the multiple ways that multiple intersecting identities were making her as the person in her identity. I think we're seeing that play out more and more nowadays, which is a really, really exciting time, I think, for queer folks and for the queer community, but also, you know, a really dangerous time because of the amount of pushback that we're seeing now, unfortunately, around the ways that it's almost like more and more people are pushing back and trying to get to define us even harder, if I can say, you know, for lack of a better term. But I think that, I guess if I had to leave like a concluding or finishing note to why identity is important, is because identity really, it's who we are as people. It's how I understand myself. It's how I understand you. It's how you understand yourself, and it's how you would understand me. And identity for me really comes down to like not only who you are, but how you are, like how you are as a person, how you can understand yourself. And that's why identity is so important, that it be ours to decide. Because if we're deciding how we are and who we are, that's ultimately going to be 10 times more important than someone else getting to decide who we are. Because if they decide who we are, then they get to decide how they can treat us. And that would be, I guess, my concluding quote unquote comment. And I hope I left enough time for Q&A while not leaving too much time. But that was sort of how I was hoping to conclude. Okay, cool.
All right, we have time. Thank you very much, Mitchell. So I'm gonna go or get up and roam around the room to see if there's any questions in the room. Obviously, I'd encourage all of the people that are online to send your questions. I think something just already popped up in the Q&A.
Yeah, I could answer that question. So someone had said, right, can I share my thoughts or discussions that I have on Bill 2 regarding gender identity? Sure.
I knew that was going to come up for sure, and I was hoping it would.
As did I. I was like, someone will ask. So just really quickly for folks who don't know, maybe I should share really quickly what Bill 2 is. Essentially, there's a proposal from the CAC from Simon Jolin Barrette. But anyways, the same person who drafted Bill 21, for those who know what Bill 21 is, same person who drafted Bill 21 is drafting this bill. So with that in mind, it's essentially an extremely transphobic bill that's being proposed right now, that's going to change the way that trans people can seek gender marker changes. It also impacts parents and trans youth as well. So amongst other things, for some history, it's a bit of a long story, but a little bit ago, the Center for Gender Advocacy, amongst a couple other trans organizing groups and LGBTQ organizing groups, sued the Quebec government, saying that the Code Civil was discriminatory against trans and intersex people. That judgment ruled mostly in our favor at that point. And a new bill was now sort of getting proposed in response to that judgment from Judge Moore, or Judge Gregory Moore. And this bill, amongst other things, proposes that we add on birth certificates now. So now when a baby is born, the birth certificate's done, you add a name for mother, you add a name for the line for father. And they've decided now to add a line that's just called parent, which is nice. It's part of what we asked for, was an option for a more gender neutral term, or for someone to be allowed to have mother and mother or father and father. But they've added parent just for trans and non-binary people. So it's ultimately a really violent tool to out trans people. If you want to bring your child to daycare or to elementary school and you want to register them, you show the birth certificate, you've just outed yourself. So one, your child might not get accepted. Your child might get discriminated at daycare or at school or treated differently. You'll probably get a bunch of grief from the administration or the teachers. So they're proposing changes to birth certificates for mother and father. They're proposing changes to for intersex people, that it has to be written now on their documents and ID, which is going to expose intersex folks to a bunch more violence. And they're proposing adding, so right now we have a gender marker on IDs. Everyone has one. So it'll say M or F on your identity. In some other provinces, you can get an X or I think a Y. But in Quebec, you get an M or an F. We argue that there need to be a third option, and that the ways that gender identity markers are shown needed to be changed and be a lot easier to change, because we argue that sex and gender are not the same thing. Well, the CAC, anyways, they decide to do something else. So after asking them to remove the gender marker, they said, we'll give you two. So they're adding, or they're proposing to add, that there will now be a sex marker and then a gender identity marker, which is, again, just a quick way to out every trans person ever. Because then when I, for example, as a trans person would show my ID, it would show sex F and then gender identity M. But cis people won't have those markers. So it's going to be an incredibly dangerous move, like a dangerous bill, like that will expose trans people to a lot of violence. Project 10 is completely opposed to the bill. And we're doing right now a lot of work, hopefully, to organize against the bill and to voice our opposition, if you will, to this bill, because in order to be able to change the sex marker on your identity as the bill proposes it, is you'll need a surgery with permanent effects that changes your sexual organs. And this is really important in the wording, because essentially what they're saying is you need to be sterilized. And this is another way to control certain populations, because it's not that, oh, if you get any surgeries or if you're on hormones that you could change your gender marker, which is what it is currently. It's very specifically, you need permanent surgery on your sexual organs. So as an example, I've had surgery, but I have not had the surgeries that they're looking for, in the sense that I could still have children today. Like if I wanted to, I could still get pregnant, even though I've had some other surgeries. And what they're referring to is that they will only approve gender marker changes now if it's a surgery that permanently changes your sexual organs, aka if you become sterilized. So then trans people can't reproduce, trans people can't have children. Then they'll let us change our gender marker, right? So it's essentially, they're trying to, I think, euthanize trans people. Maybe they haven't realized that it's cis people who keep having trans babies. But they are definitely trying to euthanize our populations. And I think that they're right now, with this bill, what it's going to mean is that trans people are not going to be able to access gender marker changes easily. Most trans people don't want certain surgeries or can't access certain surgeries. It's a huge blow to trans youth, for anyone under 18, because you can't have the surgeries that they're mandating you'll need until you're at least of the age of 18. So any trans youth won't be able to change their gender marker. It's going to out intersex people. It's just going to out basically every trans person who has any ID. And it's going to out trans parents who've had children and now want a different title on their child's birth certificate. And yeah, I guess our overall thoughts are, we're super against it. We will fight the bill as much as possible. Not to be pessimistic, we're pretty sure it will pass, unfortunately. The CAC likes to just pass them in the middle of the night, literally. But we think it will pass, but we're, I think right now, just trying to get ready for the huge amount of youth who are going to need a lot more support very, very soon. After the bill was announced that it got proposed, last week? We've gone like 10 new requests at Project 10 for a commissioner of oaths to come certify people's gender marker changes before the law passes. I think we're right now getting ready for the immense amount of folks who are going to need services now and who are going to need a lot more support because of the transphobia that this is going to open up. We're essentially moving like literally like 10,000 steps backwards. There's no other place in Canada that does this that would have such a transphobic bill that would separate trans citizens from cisgender citizens. I actually don't know if I can name any other nation or country or any other place that's trying to propose a bill or has a bill literally separating trans populations on IDs from cis populations. It's going to be a huge, huge, huge step backwards, and it would probably make Quebec potentially one of the most transphobic places to be, like legally, in the sense that we'd be the only place that separates trans people on ID cards. And we're super against it. So please fight it if you can. If petitions go out, sign them, voice your opposition to the bill. And we're obviously going to try and fight to stop it.
Thanks, Mitchell. It's important to mention that it's part of a larger package, a larger package of reforms to family law, and it's something that was slipped in, right? Very sort of subtly or incognito, I guess, hoping that it wouldn't be noticed. And if it's any consolation or if it's encouraging to you over the last couple of days, in every single one of our talks, it's come up. And there seems like there's a whole lot of resistance, and not just from LGBTQ2 plus communities. Generally, lots of people from various stations of life seem to be expressing a whole lot of worry about it. So maybe I'm a little bit more positive than you are that that part of the section dealing with that might be changed or revoked. And a lot of people are asking whether it's really purposefully done, or is this an omission? Did they try to slip it through? But only time will tell. But yes, most definitely people should hop on board and support the initiatives to block it, right? So we do have another question that's on the board there, and I don't know if you want me to read it. Can you see it, Mitchell?
Oh, sorry. Yes. So the person had said that they had been diagnosed with OCD and that it had been really calming to know that there was a group that they could identify with. And then they asked, do I believe that labels are restrictive or freeing? Personally, I think they're freeing. That's based on my own experiences, though, of course. I think there's, this immense sense of relief that can come when you have something that you can understand, that you can name. My only challenge to the way that identity works is when those labels are imposed on us, whether we like it or not, or when we're not allowed access to certain identities. We see often that a lot of people are looking for certain diagnoses, especially around mental health, and don't get them, especially around neurodivergence, and don't get them. I believe it's regarding autism, like women are severely underdiagnosed because often it's considered like, oh, like girls are just like chatty or have like a lot of special interests. So they're not like autistic. They're just like silly girls or, whatever they're trying to say. And it leads to people going through their lives, experiencing a lot of difficulties or hardships or challenges, feeling different from others and not being able to understand why. And so I think in the same way that it can be really frustrating when an identity is imposed on you and one that you don't want, the same way that we're told we're straight, we're told we're cis, the ways that there's a lot of identities when they're imposed can be really harmful. In the same way, when they're being withheld from us, they can be really devastating to have those withheld. But absolutely, I think that when we are given a name to our experience and when we are able to be told like, okay, so this is what it is, that's ultimately, I think, what helps folks find community, right? It's when people realize, oh, okay, maybe I'm gay, and then they find Project 10. It's like, oh, maybe I'm, and then they are able to find community, they're able to find community groups, and they're able to find others like them. they're able to start understanding just a bit better about themselves, ways that they can support themselves or like live a life that best adapts to their needs. And I think that identity absolutely can do that and like free someone from ways that they otherwise were feeling held back or restricted. And that when they're able to like name those experiences or have something to say, oh, okay, so maybe this is like, in your case, like my OCD, then I think that can absolutely result in someone being able to sort of breathe a bit lighter and go, okay, so maybe this is why this is. And then you can sort of address that more directly rather than feeling, not understanding why is this happening or why am I feeling this way. Absolutely, I see it as a way to liberate someone from the ways that otherwise they're thinking that there's just something wrong, but just they not understanding what.
All right, thank you. Does anybody in the room have any questions for Mitchell, or does anybody else in, the feed and the webinar attending online have any questions for Mitchell? No? Well, I have to tell you, Mitchell, that, yours was the first out of now we're sort of, what is it, presentation number 6 now, I think we're up to, or 7 in the 2 days of the festival. And I have to tell you, yours is the one that took the most positive angle about how identity can also do good, as opposed to, some of the others that sort of looked at how, identity can be polarizing, divisive, and whatnot. So it's somewhat refreshing. It's definitely a double-edged sword. You did touch upon, how it could also be or have a negative connotation potentially, in your talk too, but there was a lot of how it could be positive, right? So do we have other things here? Yeah, we have a couple of other questions. We have some time. All right. Oh no, okay, so that's you. Yeah,
I added that
all right.
long name of the
Yeah.
bill that they're sneaking it in with.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the bigger family law legislative proposal, right? That has a lot of components, right? Okay. If anybody else doesn't have anything else to add, I don't know. Do you want to add something, Mitchell, before we wrap up, or?
I mean, obviously, I'll shout out Project 10 for anyone who's interested in receiving services from us. It's free. It's mostly all on Zoom still right now. We're slowly moving back in person, but now winter's coming, so I don't know if we're gonna end up being all back online very shortly again. But it's like free services 14 to 25. Oh, thank you. There's the website. It's p10.qc.ca. Yeah, if anyone wants to, get involved or come as a participant, I imagine most people probably watching are within the age mandate. I'm in the age mandate. I'm 25. I could still receive services. Kind of cool to be the executive director and still fit in the age group, but I'm sure most people here are also probably in the age group as well. So totally.
Right. Well, you know what? Again, it's always really good to have people who are, here not too long ago, or Vanier alum, who we see progressing in life and going places and doing interesting things, right? Except to come and talk to us. So I want to thank you again for your time, Mitchell. It was really nice, and thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks to everyone else who listened.